The train station in Cheyenne was crowded with travelers, their voices creating cacophony of farewells and greetings. Among them stood 17-year-old Margaret Price, her small trunk of belongings at her feet, watching her father's carriage disappear down the street with a hollow ache expanding in her chest. He hadn't even looked back. "You'll stay with your aunt in Sacramento," he had said that morning, his voice devoid of emotion. "You'll keep quiet about your mother's condition. You'll make yourself useful and cause no trouble. If you do these things, perhaps the family name will survive this embarrassment." Her mother's condition. The scandal. The whispered conversations that had filled their Boston townhouse for months before Margaret was summoned to her father's study and informed of her exile. Her mother, Margaret had eventually learned, had suffered a complete nervous breakdown. She had been institutionalized in an asylum upstate, and her existence was now something to be hidden, denied, and forgotten by everyone who valued social respectability. And Margaret, the daughter of a broken woman, was tainted by association. The aunt in Sacramento proved to be as cold as Margaret's father. She housed Margaret in a small room above the kitchen, fed her the servants' leftovers, and gave her menial tasks: scrubbing floors, washing clothes, maintaining the garden. She spoke to Margaret only to issue orders, and she referred to her niece as a burden to anyone who would listen. 6 months into her exile, Margaret's aunt remarried and moved to San Francisco with her new husband, leaving Margaret in the care of a hired manager. The manager, a cruel man named Morrison, saw in the young woman an opportunity for profit. He began renting out Margaret's labor to neighboring ranches, pocketing the majority of her wages and giving her barely enough to survive on. For 2 years, Margaret moved from ranch to ranch, doing work that broke her body and spirit in equal measure. She was a hired hand, cleaning, cooking, tending animals, all for wages that kept her in a constant state of desperate poverty. The ranchers barely acknowledged her existence. She was invisible, replaceable, worthless. She had stopped hoping that her father would change his mind. She had stopped expecting rescue. She had stopped believing that her life would be anything other than this, an endless cycle of labor and indignity, paying some debt she didn't understand for a mother's illness she couldn't control. Then she was sent to the Colter Ranch. Thomas Colter was 53 years old and had built his ranch into one of the most successful operations in Wyoming through decades of hard work and honest dealings. He was respected by his neighbors, admired by his employees, and utterly alone. He had never married, had devoted his entire life to his work, and had recently begun to wonder whether there was any meaning to his success if there was no one to share it with. When Morrison arrived with Margaret to fulfill a contract for 3 months of labor, Thomas barely noticed her at first. She was small, thin, with hollow eyes that suggested she had learned not to expect kindness. She moved through her work with the efficiency of someone simply trying to survive the day. But over the following weeks, Thomas began to notice things. The way Margaret repaired a torn fence with precision and care, even though no one had asked for precision. The way she sang quietly to the horses as she brushed them, thinking no one could hear. The way she helped the younger ranch hands when they struggled with heavy work, offering strength and encouragement without expecting gratitude. One afternoon, Thomas found Margaret sitting alone by the creek, tears streaming silently down her face. He almost walked away. He'd been taught from childhood that tears were private things, that interfering in another's grief was inappropriate. But something in her posture, in the depth of her despair, stopped him. "Margaret," he said gently, "are you all right?" She startled, quickly wiping her eyes. "I'm fine, sir. Just needed a moment." "You don't look fine," Thomas said, moving to sit beside her on the grass. "You look like someone carrying a weight too heavy to bear alone." Margaret looked at this man, her employer, someone of power and authority, and something in his genuine concern broke through the walls she'd built around her heart. Words came pouring out. She told him about her mother's breakdown, about her father's rejection, about her 2 years of exploitation and labor, about the way the world had deemed her worthless simply because of circumstances beyond her control. Thomas listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret," he said finally, "your value as a person has nothing to do with your circumstances. You are valuable because you exist, because you have a mind and a heart and the capacity to care about others, even when no one has shown you that care. Your father's abandonment says everything about his character and nothing about yours. Over the following months, Thomas began to see Margaret differently. He noticed her intelligence, her resilience, her kindness. He started giving her more complex tasks, helping manage inventory, training the younger ranch hands, making decisions about the day-to-day operations. He invited her to join him for supper instead of eating separately, began teaching her about ranching operations, and treated her with the respect usually reserved for a valued partner rather than hired help. When her 3-month contract expired, Morrison came to collect her, ready to reassign her to another ranch. Thomas surprised everyone by informing Morrison that he was buying out her contract. Not for more money. He offered significantly less than her market value, but because he was giving her a choice. Margaret is no longer available for hire, Thomas told Morrison. She's my ward. I'm sending her to school in Laramie for the next year. After that, she'll return here as a manager of the household and the ranch operations. She will be paid a fair wage and treated with the respect she deserves. Morrison, knowing he had no leverage against a man of Thomas's wealth and standing, accepted the offer, and Margaret found herself on a train to Laramie, unable to believe that her life was about to change. The year in Laramie was transformative. Margaret was enrolled in a small academy that specialized in educating young women for positions of responsibility. She studied literature, history, mathematics, and accounting. She learned to read and write with greater sophistication. She learned about the world beyond the ranch, and she began to understand that her value wasn't determined by her father's rejection or her previous circumstances. When she returned to the Colter Ranch after a year, she was a different woman, stronger, more confident, more certain of her own worth. And Thomas, watching her step down from the carriage, realized something that had been growing in his heart for months. He had fallen in love with her, but he was careful. Margaret had been betrayed by every man in her life. Her father had abandoned her, Morrison had exploited her, and countless ranchers had treated her as invisible. Thomas wanted her to understand that his feelings for her came with no expectations, no demands, no strings attached. "I have something I want to discuss with you," he said one evening as they reviewed the ranch accounts together. "I've been thinking about the future. I'm getting older, and I want to ensure that the ranch is well managed after I'm gone. I'd like to make you my heir. Legally, officially, you'll inherit this ranch and everything I own. Not as my employee, not as my ward, but as my chosen successor. You've earned it through your intelligence, your dedication, and your genuine care for this place." Margaret stared at him in shock. "Thomas, I can't. That's too much." "I'm not." "You are," he interrupted gently. "You're exactly the person I want managing this ranch. You care about the land, about the horses, about the people who work here. You have the intelligence to make good decisions, and the character to make ethical ones. That's what matters." He paused, and his voice grew softer. "But I also want you to know something else. Over the past year, watching you grow and transform and become the remarkable woman you are, I've come to love you, not because you're grateful or because you owe me anything, but because you're extraordinary. And if you're willing, I'd like to ask you to marry me, not as a transaction, not as a way to secure your future. Your future is already secure through your inheritance, but as my partner, my equal, and the person I want to share my life with." Margaret cried then, not tears of despair, but tears of joy and disbelief and the overwhelming realization that she had been loved all along, not by her biological father, but by a man who had chosen to see her worth when no one else could. "Yes," she said through her tears. "Yes to all of it. Yes to inheriting the ranch. Yes to managing it. Yes to marrying you. Yes to building a life together." They were married in the spring of 1894, in a ceremony attended by the entire community. Margaret, who had been deemed worthless and disposable by her own father, became one of the most respected women in Wyoming, not because of Thomas's name or wealth, but because of the person she had become through his belief in her. Thomas lived for another 20 years, and though they never had biological children, they made a point of mentoring younger people, particularly young women who had been discarded or abandoned by their families. Margaret became known as someone who would give opportunity to those society had written off, just as Thomas had done for her. When Thomas died at 73, Margaret inherited the massive Colter Ranch, which she managed successfully for another 15 years. She used her wealth to establish a school for young women from difficult backgrounds, giving them the same opportunity for education and transformation that she had been given. And in her private study, on a shelf with her most treasured possessions, Margaret kept a single photograph. Thomas Colter, the man who had seen past her circumstances to the treasure that lay beneath, the man who had taught her that abandonment by one person could be healed by genuine love and belief from another, the man who had made her not just his heir, but his greatest treasure as well.